In medieval Britain, if you were convicted of high treason, they didn't just kill you. They killed you, and then they kept going. The punishment known as being hanged, drawn, and quartered was the official state response to treason for centuries, and it was not a quick or merciful process. It was deliberate, it was staged, and every single step of it was designed to humiliate you as completely as possible, before, during, and after your death. It starts before you even reach the gallows. The condemned man was tied to a wooden frame called a hurdle and dragged through the streets behind a horse all the way to the execution site. By the time he arrived, he was already covered in cuts and lacerations from being scraped across the ground. That was just the opening act. Once he got there, a rope was placed around his neck and he was hanged, but not hanged to death. They'd cut him down while he was still conscious, still alive, still aware of what was happening to him. And then the real part began. He was disemboweled while alive, his entrails removed and burned in front of him. Then he was beheaded. And then, finally, his body was hacked into 4 pieces. I want to be clear about something here. This was not a mob losing control. This was a scheduled government event with trained executioners following a specific procedure in a specific order. The whole thing was choreographed. The state had decided, very deliberately, that death alone was not a sufficient message, and so they engineered the most comprehensive act of degradation they could manage. But it didn't even stop there. Once the body had been quartered, the pieces were parboiled in water mixed with spices. And the reason for that is genuinely insane. They were preserving the flesh. Because those body parts were then sent on a tour. They'd be shipped to different towns across the country and displayed at city gates, on bridges, on poles. The head usually ended up on a spike somewhere prominent. This was, more or less, the medieval equivalent of a public service announcement. The message being, this is what happens. Look at it. Remember it. One of the most documented cases is David Tyree, a civil servant from Portsmouth who was convicted in 1782 of passing British naval secrets to France. He was hanged for 23 minutes before being cut down. Still alive, he was then disemboweled, beheaded, and his body was cut into quarters in front of a crowd that had gathered to watch. By the accounts of people who were there, it was not a quiet afternoon. These executions drew enormous crowds, because this was also, on some level, entertainment. The state put on a show and the public came to see it. What makes this punishment so uniquely awful, beyond the obvious, is the thought that went into it. Somebody sat down and worked out how to make dying as drawn out and degrading as possible, and then the government codified it into law and repeated it for hundreds of years. The punishment had been in use since at least 1283, when it was formally established as the penalty for treason in England. That's a long time to keep doing something like this. The last time it was carried out was in 1839. By that point, public attitudes had started to shift, and there was a growing sense that maybe hauling a man's body parts through the streets in front of crowds wasn't the most dignified thing a government could be doing. The spectacle that had once been the whole point had started to feel like a liability. People weren't being deterred so much as disturbed. The practice was finally abolished in 1870, after the government quietly concluded that parading body parts through the streets was doing more harm than good to the public's opinion of the crown. The Romans didn't invent crucifixion, but they spent about 500 years perfecting it. The Assyrians and Babylonians had been doing versions of it long before Rome existed, and the Persians picked it up from there. But the Romans looked at what everyone else had been doing and decided it wasn't nearly thorough enough. What they built around it wasn't just an execution method. It was a complete system designed to strip a person of every last shred of dignity before they were even close to dead. The first thing you need to understand is that crucifixion was never meant for Roman citizens. It was reserved almost exclusively for slaves, conquered foreigners, and criminals of the lowest social standing. To a Roman, being crucified wasn't just dying, it was being publicly classified as subhuman. That was the whole point. The message wasn't just "this person is dead," it was "this person was never really one of us to begin with." And the process started well before anyone saw a cross. On the morning of the execution, the condemned was stripped naked and tied to a post, and then beaten across the back and chest with a flagellum, a multi-tailed leather whip with pieces of bone and metal woven into the ends. This wasn't a warm-up. Done with enough force, scourging could tear significant chunks of flesh away from the body and, in some cases, kill the person outright before the real punishment even started. The Romans were careful not to let that happen too often. Dying during the flogging would have been getting off easy. After the scourging, the condemned was forced to carry the heavy wooden crossbeam through the city to the execution site, naked, bleeding, surrounded by crowds who were actively encouraged to throw things and shout. The Romans wanted as many people as possible to see this. The public humiliation was not a side effect. It was the entire design. By the time the condemned reached the site, they had already been on display for hours. At the cross, the person was thrown onto their back and nails were driven through the wrists, not the palms, which can't support the weight of a body, and then into the wood. The crossbeam was hoisted up and fastened to the upright post. The feet were then nailed or bound to the lower shaft. And then came the part that made crucifixion so particularly awful as a method of killing, which was that it didn't kill quickly. Death came from a slow, progressive asphyxiation. To breathe, the person had to push upward with their legs and pull against the nails in their wrists, relieving the pressure on their chest just long enough to exhale. When the muscles gave out, they couldn't breathe. The whole process could take anywhere from 6 hours to 4 days, depending on the individual's physical condition and how much damage the scourging had already done. 6 hours to 4 days. Conscious and in full sun, unable to sit, unable to lie down, unable to do anything but choose between the pain of breathing and the suffocation of not breathing. There is no version of this that isn't completely horrifying. Rome used crucifixion regularly for about 5 centuries before the Emperor Constantine abolished it in the 4th century AD, largely due to its association with the execution of Jesus of Nazareth and the rise of Christianity throughout the empire. But by that point, tens of thousands of people had already died this way across the Roman world. The single most famous mass use of crucifixion happened in 71 BC, following the defeat of the slave rebellion led by Spartacus. Spartacus himself was killed in the final battle, his body never identified among the dead, but roughly 6,000 of his followers were captured alive in the aftermath, and the Roman general Crassus had a very specific idea about what to do with them. After Spartacus was defeated, Crassus lined the entire 200-kilometer road between Capua and Rome with 6,000 crosses, each one carrying one of his captured followers, and left them there. For nearly 1,000 years, China had an execution method called Lingchi, which translates roughly to slow slicing, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The basic idea was this: the condemned was brought out, tied to a post, and then an executioner with a very specific set of skills and a very sharp knife would begin removing pieces of their body, one cut at a time, keeping them alive throughout the entire process. Not alive in some vague, barely conscious sense. Alive and aware. The whole point was that you stayed that way for as long as possible. The executioners who carried this out weren't just butchers swinging blindly. They had detailed anatomical knowledge of exactly which cuts would cause maximum pain without hitting anything that would kill you too quickly. It was methodical, almost clinical, which, honestly, makes it worse. The method was practiced in China from around the 10th century all the way through to 1905, nearly 1,000 years of use, and it was reserved for the most serious crimes imaginable, things like treason, killing a parent, or murdering your husband. The idea behind it, at least in the legal framework that justified it, was that the punishment had to match the severity of the offense. And apparently, for the worst offenders, death by any normal means wasn't considered sufficient. You had to be taken apart. Now, if you want a specific example of how far this could actually go, I give you Liu Jin. Liu Jin was a eunuch official in the court of the Ming dynasty in the early 1500s, and he had accumulated an absolutely staggering amount of power and wealth through corruption. He was essentially running the empire behind the scenes, while the emperor rubber-stamped whatever he decided. By the time he was finally caught and accused of plotting a rebellion in 1510, the list of charges against him was reportedly so long it took days to read aloud. The emperor was furious, and so Liu Jin was sentenced to Lingchi. His execution lasted 3 days. Over those 3 days, he received a reported 3,357 individual cuts. I want you to sit with that number for a second. 3,357. That is not an execution. That is a project. The executioners worked through a precise sequence, removing small pieces of flesh from his chest, his arms, his thighs, carefully avoiding anything that would send him into shock too quickly or bleed him out before they were finished with him. He reportedly survived into the second day before losing consciousness, at which point he was already missing significant portions of his body. They finished the sentence regardless. And then it got weirder. After it was over, his flesh was reportedly purchased and eaten by people in Beijing who had suffered under his corrupt rule. That part isn't entirely confirmed by every historical source, but enough accounts mention it that most historians treat it as credible. The man had made a lot of enemies. What gets me about Lingchi, beyond the obvious, is the sheer investment of expertise that went into it. The Romans could crucify thousands of people at once because it didn't require much skill. Anyone with lumber and nails could manage it. Lingchi required trained executioners who spent years learning exactly how the human body worked so they could dismantle it as slowly as possible. There's something deeply unsettling about that level of institutional knowledge being passed down, refined, and improved upon over the course of centuries. Someone sat down at some point and thought, we can make this last longer, and then someone else figured out how. By the time the Qing dynasty was winding down in the early 20th century, there were reformers pushing hard to modernize the legal system and abolish what they considered barbaric punishments. Lingchi was near the top of that list. The practice was officially banned in 1905, and the last photographs taken of a Lingchi execution reportedly disturbed even the people who had pushed to have it outlawed. The ancient Persians had an execution method so creative in its cruelty that when Greek historians first described it, people probably assumed they were exaggerating. And honestly, I don't blame them, because compared to everything we've covered so far, Scaphism operates on a completely different level of nightmare. This wasn't just about pain. It was about engineering a situation where the victim's own body became the instrument of their destruction, and there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. Here's how it worked. The condemned person was forced to consume enormous quantities of milk and honey, not as a kindness, but until their body couldn't take it anymore, and they had completely uncontrollable diarrhea. Then they were strapped between 2 hollowed-out logs or boats, one on top of the other, with just their head, hands, and feet sticking out through holes cut in the wood. Think of it like a human sandwich, except the filling is a person who can't move, can't turn over, can't do anything at all. They were then placed in a stagnant pond or swamp, floating there in the sun, completely immobilized. And then the Persians smeared their exposed skin, their face, their hands, their feet, with more milk and honey. Within hours the insects found them. Flies first, then wasps, then whatever else happened to be living in that swamp. They covered every exposed surface, drawn in by the sweetness and the smell. But the flies weren't just landing on the skin, they were laying eggs, and those eggs would hatch, and what hatched would begin eating the victim from the outside in, and eventually from the inside out, crawling into any opening they could find. I'm not going to spell that part out any further. You get the idea. What makes this so much worse than just being attacked by insects is the helplessness of it. The victim could feel everything happening to them and could not move a single inch to stop any of it. Their hands were sticking out through the logs but bound. Their head was exposed, but there was nowhere to turn. They were floating, completely at the mercy of every insect in that swamp, in full sunlight, for hours and then days. And here's the part that really gets me. The Persians weren't trying to kill them quickly. The whole point was to keep them alive as long as possible. So they'd come back every single day and force-feed the victim more milk and honey. Enough to keep them breathing. Enough to keep the process going. The feeding ensured they couldn't die of thirst or starvation, which meant their body was being kept in working order specifically so it could continue to suffer. The feces and vomit that inevitably accumulated inside the wooden frame, combined with the heat and the insects, created conditions that began rotting the victim from the outside, while they were still very much conscious and present. The psychological component of this is almost impossible to wrap your head around. You're floating in a swamp. You cannot move. You know exactly what is happening to you. You know it will continue happening tomorrow because they'll come back and feed you again. There's no escaping it, no fighting it, no doing anything except enduring it. That kind of helplessness, stretched over days and days, is its own specific category of horror that sits completely apart from the physical suffering. The Greek historian Plutarch documented one of the only named victims of Scaphism, a Persian soldier named Mithridates, who had killed a member of the royal family and been sentenced to die this way. According to Plutarch, he survived for 17 days before he finally died. 17 days. And if Plutarch's account is accurate, those 17 days were exactly what I just described, every single one of them, with his captors returning each morning to make sure he had enough food and water to keep going a little longer. Some historical accounts suggest victims lasted more than 2 weeks, which means the Persians had essentially engineered a method where the only mercy was that it eventually ended. Flaying, being skinned alive, shows up in enough separate civilizations that it's genuinely unsettling how many people, completely independently, arrived at the same idea. The Assyrians were doing it as far back as 911 BC. Medieval European executioners were doing it to traitors. The Aztecs incorporated it into their religious rituals, and none of these groups had any meaningful contact with each other. There is something deeply uncomfortable about that. Apparently, when enough people in power want to send a message, they eventually land on the same answer. The basic method is more or less what you'd expect, and also somehow worse. The executioner would make incisions at the extremities, the legs, the arms, sometimes the torso, and then slowly peel the skin away from the underlying muscle and tissue, trying to keep it as intact as possible. The goal wasn't just to kill the person. The goal was to remove their skin in one piece, because that skin had a use afterward, and the condemned was kept alive through as much of this as possible, which is the part that makes it genuinely difficult to think about for very long. Here's why it's so catastrophic physiologically. Your skin is not just a covering. It regulates temperature, it protects against infection, and it contains an enormous concentration of nerve endings. The moment significant portions of it are removed, the body goes into shock. Every exposed nerve ending fires constantly. The underlying muscle tissue, which was never meant to be exposed to open air, becomes immediately vulnerable to infection and blood loss. Victims would experience a cascading series of failures, hemorrhage, septic shock, overwhelming pain, and the process could still take hours. Some survived long enough to wish very sincerely that they hadn't, and then there was the aftermath. The skin, once removed, wasn't discarded. It was stretched across city walls, nailed to gates, or raised on poles at the entrance to towns. This was the point. The execution itself was the private part, relatively speaking. The display was the public announcement. Anyone approaching the city would see it and understand immediately what happened to people who challenged the people in charge. It was a warning system made out of human remains, and it worked because the alternative to seeing it was becoming it. The Assyrian Empire, which ran from roughly 911 to 609 BC, used flaying specifically on rebel leaders. Not common criminals, not soldiers captured in battle. The kings reserved it for the people who had dared to stand against them directly, which made the message even more specific. This is what happens to leaders. This is what happens to the person you followed. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal was proud enough of this practice that he had his scribes record it in detail on stone cylinders, noting that the skins of his enemies were stretched across the walls of their own cities. Impalement goes back to at least 1772 BC, when Babylonian King Hammurabi apparently decided that hanging was not making enough of a statement. The method is exactly as straightforward and horrible as it sounds. A sharpened wooden stake is driven into the body through the base, and then the stake is erected upright, so that gravity does the rest of the work. The victim's own weight slowly pulls them downward, the stake tearing through organs and tissue as it goes, until it eventually exits somewhere around the shoulder or the throat. That process could take hours. In some cases, it took days. The executioners actually had to be careful not to hit major arteries on the way in, because a quick death from blood loss was not the point. The point was the slow part. What makes this one particularly grim is how widely it spread. Babylon in 1772, BC, ancient Persia, the Ottoman Empire, medieval Europe. These cultures had almost no contact with each other, and yet all of them independently looked at this method and thought, yes, this is the one. That tells you something about how effective it must have been as a deterrent, because it is genuinely one of the most terrible ways a human body can fail. Every movement makes it worse. There is no position that helps, and you are doing it in public, on display, while people walk past. The name most associated with impalement is Vlad the Impaler, the 15th century Wallachian prince who turned it into something almost industrial in scale. Vlad Dracula, as he was known, used impalement so frequently and so enthusiastically that his own people eventually gave him a nickname for it. He didn't just impale enemies in ones and twos. He impaled them by the thousands, arranging the bodies in deliberate patterns outside his city, reportedly organizing them by rank, with higher-ranking victims placed on taller stakes. There are accounts of him eating meals surrounded by fields of impaled corpses, which, that's a lot. That's a really specific kind of broken. His most famous use of it came when the Ottoman army, led by Mehmed II, marched on his capital. Vlad had retreated, and as the Ottomans advanced, they encountered what historians now call the Forest of the Impaled. An estimated 20,000 to 30,000 bodies, impaled on stakes outside the city. Some accounts put the number even higher. The smell alone would have been catastrophic. The Ottomans had one of the most powerful armies in the world at the time, and what stopped them was not a fortress or a military engagement. It was the psychological collapse of walking into something that looked like that. The last recorded use of impalement as an execution method was during the Armenian genocide in the early 20th century, carried out by Ottoman forces, which means this particular method spans nearly 3,700 years of recorded human history from its first appearance to its last. When the Ottoman army marched toward Vlad's capital and found the fields outside the city filled with tens of thousands of impaled bodies, they reportedly turned around and went home. Around 570 BC, a craftsman named Perillos walked into the court of the Sicilian tyrant Phalaris with a gift, a hollow bronze bull, and what he considered a genuinely brilliant idea. The bull was cast entirely from bronze, hollow on the inside, with a small door built into its flank large enough to fit a human being. The idea was simple. You lock someone inside, light a fire beneath the bull, and the metal slowly heats up until the person inside is roasted alive. But Perillos hadn't just built a fancy oven. He'd engineered the head of the bull with a system of internal tubes and chambers, designed so that, as the victim screamed, the sound would travel through the tubes and emerge from the bull's mouth transformed into something that resembled the bellowing of an actual animal. The screams of a dying human being, converted into the sound of livestock. He was apparently very proud of this. Phalaris, to his credit, seemed genuinely impressed. He asked Perillos to demonstrate how the acoustic system worked, and Perillos, either not reading the room or deeply overestimating how safe he was in that moment, climbed inside to show him. Phalaris locked the door behind him and lit the fire. Perillos became the first person ever executed in his own invention. There is a version of events where Phalaris pulled him out before he died and had him thrown off a cliff instead, which honestly does not make things better for Perillos in any meaningful way. Either way, the man who built the thing went into the thing, which is a pretty brutal way for a career to end. Stories of the bull's horrific purpose spread throughout Sicily, reaching far beyond the city's walls. Phalaris deliberately cultivated this notorious reputation, using the gruesome instrument as an increasingly powerful tool of psychological intimidation. Phalaris went on to use the bull extensively, and his reputation for cruelty became so well known that his name survived for centuries as a shorthand for what a tyrant actually looks like. The bull sat there in Agrigentum as a symbol of his power, and for a while that probably felt permanent to him. It wasn't. When the people of Agrigentum eventually rose up and overthrew Phalaris, they burned him alive in the same bull he had used on so many others, which, as endings go, seems about right.